Good evening and welcome to The Square, our very first time going live tonight. Tonight we'll be focusing on meetings, incentives, conferences, events and exhibitions, commonly known by the abbreviation MICE. And a lot of meetings have been taking place this week in Kigali. Most significant, as we all know, the extraordinary African Union Summit, which historically saw the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. My name is Dan Mpisi. I am part of The Square. As always, I'm joined by my lovely co-hosts. Berna, welcome to The Square.
Thank you.
Charles.
Thank you. How are you?
Ephraim, I'm good.
Yeah, thank you.
How does it feel going live? Yeah, I know, it's very interesting. So tonight we'll also be joined by our first guest on The Square. Her name is Alphonsine Mukamunana, and she's here as a team member of the National Joint Inspection Team as we discuss the achievements and challenges of MICE. But before we get to that, I'd like us to just briefly recap on what I said before, a very historic moment, a milestone for the continent, the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Berna, what's your take? What are your general expectations of this signing?
First of all, I would like to congratulate the whole team that has worked behind the scenes to make this happen. I don't think it's been easy at all to get more than 40 countries to agree to one dream. It doesn't come easily, so well done to the team. But I feel that now is the time to get the real work. It's not going to be easy, but I hope that the indications that we've seen, the political will that we are seeing will continue, because Africans are tired of signing agreements that never come to fruit. So now is the time. Hopefully, we will prove the skeptics wrong, that Africa is indeed rising, and the ratifications will come in as soon as, as possible. We shouldn't be having several meetings going back and forth. And hopefully, the few countries that haven't yet signed will be able to sign
on board.
As soon as possible.
Ephraim?
It's historic. And I say this because it shows a change in the desire, or at least the political will, to see things on the continent improve. I, however, as a businessman, I look at it as a challenge to myself and my fellow compatriots in the sector, that we cannot do business as usual. And I say this speaking purely about Rwanda. When you talk of a continental free trade area, the only way you can truly maximize that is through production. If I asked you today, what is Rwanda going to export to other African countries under this continental free trade area, I don't think you can list more than 5 things that we are truly good at, or at least competitive at. So there is that challenge for us as the private sector in Rwanda to find something that we can niche and export. But again, I'm excited because it's a huge opportunity. I can tell you as a businessman, my largest client base is other people in other African countries. And it's good to see that now it's going to ease that for me. To have 44 countries sign, that's massive. But then you can also see, guys, and this is also another thing, people take for granted the power of trade versus, because I think only 20, slightly above 20, signed the movement of people.
I think 27.
27.
Yes.
But then 44 signed for trade. So guys are like, look, we'd rather do business together, but
our borders are still
our borders are still
closed.
our borders, which shows you that trade is a starting point. And I know we've talked of, and I might get idealistic in this context. We've talked of a United States of Africa, and I think people who have always talked about it said that trade is the starting point, and this is evident today. It's monumental. Hopefully, the signing shall lead to ratification, and ratification may lead to action. But again, the private sector has to get fully engaged. Yeah.
Charles, what are your expectations?
A few things. One, by far, it's historical. That's no doubt. But I think we need to be very cautious and manage expectations, manage emotions, manage what everybody thinks will come out of this. And I'll start from the political angle. That it's going to be a long, rough road for us to actually get this CFTA into implementation. the ratification that comes with it, and wooing some of the member countries that did not come to the party.
Yeah.
You know, some of them are heavyweights, some of them have flimsy reasons, and you need everyone on board. You know, if we are going to grow potatoes in Rwanda, and we cannot easily get potato chips to export to Nigeria because Nigeria is not party to the CFTA, then, and yet Nigeria is a very big market for us, or Ethiopia, or some of the others, then that's a very fundamental issue. So the political will that has been manifested by the countries that signed has to be replicated to those that have not signed. And let us look deeply into the reasons why some of those countries have not signed. On a lighter note, if it requires that we use football tactics to woo some of our neighbors who have been unwilling to come to the party,
or grow avocados.
We may as well do that, but we need everybody to come to the party, and I think that's extremely crucial.
I think there's I would say, from what I've understood, like I'll even talk of Nigeria, you know, and I think even His Excellency said at the press conference just towards the evening, there are internal issues in some of those countries that have prevented some of those countries from signing on board. It doesn't mean that they're not interested. I can tell you, I think for Nigeria, I think it's the election, if I'm not wrong, and what that means for them. Because I think Buhari has been endorsed as the candidate for his party, if I'm not wrong, to go for the next term. So him as the electorate is not necessarily happy with the way he handled his past tenure. Granted, also for him, he had health issues. But you'd find that maybe he wouldn't want to commit to something like that until he has gone through his internal strategy towards his campaigns. So again, but I think for me, what gives me hope is his political will. Now we have to marry that political will with, or match it with the reality on the ground. So,
Ephraim, when you raise examples of Nigeria, it just tells you that the importance of strong leadership is extremely paramount, one, in getting us to where we are, but subsequently in taking us to the next step. And when you analyze some of the countries that have stayed back from this, you'll find that those are either countries that have political gaps currently, or that have historical political shortcomings here and there. And I believe that it may be a very difficult angle for the AU to tackle as a continent. And it's very important that they've tackled our challenges from a trade angle. But it tells you that in the event, however well we may be good at doing business with one another, in as long as we have leadership challenges in our respective countries, we will not go that far.
And Charles, on the issue of leadership, one of the things that you speak, one of the things that came out of this signing in terms of leadership was, putting issues behind the two countries, between Rwanda and South Africa. That was a milestone. Knowing that these issues of visas, President Ramaphosa said it's something that consider it solved, and this is something that various people are going to work.
I have my reservations with that because I'll only be happy
when you see it.
Once it is done, because some of these statements can be politically pregnant, and until you actually see it come to life, will you actually believe this? I am optimistic with reservations. Yes,
I think beyond that, we have to look at beyond the politics, what the private sector is interested in, because you have to remember that with trade, it's actually mainly the private sector. So in most of these countries, you really have a very strong, vibrant private sector that sort of pushes the political agenda. So partly, I know for Nigeria, beyond the politics, they have a very strong private sector, which says if you're not willing to compromise on ABCD, we are pulling out. So I think this is also something that we'll have to be addressed. across board, because in some countries you have a very, very influential and strong private sector. It will play out in the process of ratification, and we'll be seeing that when it goes to several parties.
Actually, on that, one of the things I'm really looking forward to on the signing and implementation of the AFCFTA is how we are going to balance or level the playing fields, because there are going to be uneven costs and benefits of the implementation of this
I'll give you
particular agreement.
I'll give you one simple example. The FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods, Kenya and Uganda, actually Uganda particularly, is significantly more competitive than anybody I know in the region when it comes to FMCG. And that's even still with its inefficiencies in its tax systems. Now imagine immediately you open up the borders to allow, because already EAC we do that. But now imagine now you've got economies competing for the same kind of, because I know Unilever has a plant in Kenya and they also have a plant in South Africa where they produce some of these products. I think the challenge is, how do we create economic specialization across this trade area where countries focus and hone in on certain skills? And Rwanda, we wanted to be an education hub, a tech hub, and a financial hub, a services hub. But how can we accelerate that? I know one of the biggest challenges we have, which is part of services, is the customer service. And for me personally, as Rwandan, every time I have guests over, I always ask them to tell me about the experience and to be honest. Then I take that feedback with me to the people who it was rendered for, and so that we can improve in that if we're going to be this services hub we want to be. But I feel like economic specialization has to be part of that agenda, because what's going to happen is smaller economies are going to get dwarfed by the larger ones, and it's just going to continue to create that divide where you find that now they create this, it's not a symbiotic relationship between economies. It now becomes a parasitical one where these large economies are carrying the weight of these smaller economies, because these smaller economies don't have the capacity to produce themselves. So,
but there are mechanisms that are going to be put in place, obviously, to deal with some of these issues.
So that's it. So I would say personally, from somebody looking from the outside in, because you're talking about how do we ensure that the local players, and you talked of the private sector and the role they play, don't also forget there's a huge informal sector. And I think we'll talk about it later when we start to talk about MICE and then we'll talk about the restaurants. But the idea is that when you start to increase scale and there is a huge economic opportunity, but it can become very exclusionary and very elite, in the sense that you find that because there's such a huge opportunity and there's such a free market, the mechanisms of capitalism take hold. And now the mechanisms of capitalism are based on the fundamental principle that the people operating within that framework are not greedy, are willing to share, but that's not how it works. When somebody gets 30% of the market share, he's not going to be like, oh, I'm okay, let me leave a little bit for everybody else. No, he's going to say, I want to take everything. So you find that it has the potential, and I think for me, if we can, those economic specialization will help curb it, at least
so for instance, if Ghana is known for producing cocoa, let them do it.
Do that
exactly.
well.
And they do
if
it
Uganda
well.
is known for producing this and this.
Exactly. Granted, it gets very hard to convince the business people within those countries. But then if we create incentives for that cross-border business operations, so where somebody is like, for example, let's say I'm in farming, I'm in agriculture, and let's say we have decided that within the East African bloc, or at least within the CFTA, Ethiopia is going to be the country that handles agricultural produce. I will be incentivized to go set up my business there. So then it also helps with that cultural exchange. But then if we're signing CFTA and we're not signing the free movement of people, it comes a bit. It's a slightly contradictory in that sense. It's like we want the cake, but we don't want it with certain things. We want to pick and choose.
And actually, I think President Ramaphosa labored that point. We cannot be seated here talking about free movement of goods and services when we're not addressing the issue of free movement of people.
And I think beyond that, I think beyond even movement of people, beyond movement of people, the infrastructure gap in these countries has to be addressed. Otherwise, the cost of doing business will continue to be high, and it will make it impossible for the private sector to take advantage of the opportunities availed by the free trade. So part of the challenge going forward has to be addressing the huge infrastructure deficit on the continent, which continues to, make the cost of doing business on the continent almost impossible.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're cutting for a break, just a few seconds. Please stay tuned.
To build an African agenda around science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It seeks to create a Pan-African platform for young scientists to promote and facilitate innovation, science, and technology.
We are looking forward to welcoming you to Kigali for the next forum in 2018.
Welcome back, and onto the meat of tonight's show is MICE, known as Meetings, Incentives, Conferences, Events, and Exhibitions. Tonight, in this discussion, we are joined with Alphonsine Mukamunana. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Diana.
Happy to have you here. You're our first guest, so we're really honored that you respected our invitation. So my first question is to you, Alphonsine. As you all know, the economic impact of MICE in Rwanda is very significant. In 2017, Rwanda hosted 169 international meetings, which brought tens and thousands of customers to our hotels, our restaurants, and also to a national airline. According to figures from RDB, $47 million was injected into the economy. And based on that, in a bid to ensure quality standards in the hospitality industry, we are aware that a national joint inspection team was set up. Recently, this team shut down 13 hotels and restaurants in Kigali for failure to comply. And Alphonsine, over to you. Can you elaborate more on these reasons, the closure, the standards that are supposed to be met as we talk about MICE in Rwanda?
Okay, thank you, Diana. First of all, there is a point of correction. We closed temporary, not a permanent, temporary of the hospitalities, hotels and restaurants. Mainly our inspection focus on three elements, which the first one is ensuring safety and health of our guests and population in general. The second is standard compliance in both infrastructure and in services as the standards in the regional and the international criteria. The third one is client satisfaction. So those are three key elements that we focus on during our inspection. Regarding the first one, which is very key, ensuring the health and safety of our client and the population, we have what we call the 5 key WHO fundamental food safety. So means what? Once we visit or we conducted the inspection in the food premises, we remind them on those 5 key. The first one is food supply, where they use the fresh food. The second one is storage system. If the fridge are calibrated, if they keep food at appropriate temperature. The other one is a cooling system, if it is working. The other one is regarding the cooking, if they serve food which are well cooked. The last one is regarding the food handlers, hygiene and safety, for in order to prevent the contagious disease that those staff can contaminate our guests or clients, where we request them to have a medical certificate from a recognized government institution.
So, Alphonsine, you're here. You're an environmental health specialist based at the Ministry of Health, but you're also here because you're part of the National Joint Inspection Team. If you can elaborate a bit about the team, when was it set up and who is it comprised of? Which institutions make up the team?
The team was established almost in 2012. It is composed by different government institutions, even the private one. There is Ministry of Health, City of Kigali, RDB, RSB, Rwanda National Police. There is also WASAC for the water supply system and the water storage. There is a leg. There is also the ADECOR, Association des Consommateurs, as the private one. So all are the members of the National Inspection Team.
And before my colleagues put some questions to you and we move up to other elements of MICE, my question was, you shut down these restaurants, and I wanted to know, do you check on them? How often do you check on them? Is it once a year? Is it when there are only big meetings happening in town? What is the regularity of visiting and inspecting these establishments? And I think I want to ask you, instead of closing them down temporarily, of course, isn't it better to maybe ask them to pay a fine? And in this way, when they know they're below quality standards, paying a fine, it means a lot more to them than shutting down and they open. And so what's the regularity of inspection? And instead of closure, have you considered just fining these establishments?
Okay, thank you. These inspections are the routine inspection, not the inspection is done because we have a national event. I can give you an example. In the 2 last months, we conducted this inspection even out of Kigali. So we went in the districts where we visit Huye, Musanze, Rubavu, even the Eastern Province. We inspected some food premises, even we closed one. It is a regular inspection. The team was set, as I said before, in 2012, and we have a plan to work on it. But we put much effort when we have like national events.
I like what Alphonsine has just said, that more effort is put in when we have national events.
Basically, was it 2012 and now
when it's regular inspection, they just have a piece of paper. But when there's a national event, they move around with padlocks. So, you see, some of these places are places that we frequent. Personally, I'll talk about Sundowner. I go to Sundowner relatively frequently, at least once every 10 days. But it's for you to wait when we have a very big event and then you clamp them down as if you did not know that they had those issues, or as if there is no proper coordination with people in the entertainment sector to say, hello, we are expecting a large delegation of people
but Charles,
who will need to be entertained.
But just very quickly, what Alphonsine said is that these checkups are regular.
No,
and
if they were regular,
but if we don't know,
but have you heard of restaurants being closed before this time?
I've heard of restaurants being closed without even any national event.
No, but you see, the question I have is 2012 and this is 2018, 6 years. I'm curious to know if, because the rate at which we closed this time around, compared to the rate at which we've closed from 2012 up until today, whether this is not, and again, for me, I feel like we call a spade a spade. Instead of us saying that this is in the benefit of the Rwandan consumer, we need to say it's for us, when we get international guests, to ensure that our quality standards are up to par. And we call it that. Instead of us saying, no, this is a situation where we do regular inspections, and that for me, I think, is what I understand Charlie to be saying.
More so, I think for me, during this week, we didn't need the wrong headlines. I mean, and by that I mean having headlines around so and so. This hotel has been closed. No, yeah, it's the wrong week to have the wrong headline. So if you have done your homework, we shouldn't be having these issues close to the meeting.
Yeah. We should have them away.
That's
they
one.
should have an appraisal process before.
If the checks are routine, how do I know as a client if I walk into a hotel, where is the ranking that the hygiene of this place is either 5 or 3 or 4? Where is that?
Can we let Alphonsine answer before we take a break and move on to the next topic?
Yeah, if I can say that this inspection is done, as I said before, on the regular basis in order to protect the public health. To close a temporary food establishment, it is not a punishment. It is just to give them a way of improvement. So you know that we have, as inspectors, I talk about the 3 elements that we focus on. If it becomes a health issue, which can cause a health problem, so in that time, we take action of temporary closure, because you know that we have to protect our guests, even our consumers.
But you see, nobody disagrees with that.
Yeah.
We agree with the intention. What we're saying is how it is done and when it is done.
It feels like it's done.
Because it's a big meeting.
Right
We want the focus to be around trade, not restaurants closing.
But I think I understand her. And I would also come to her defense and say it makes sense that regular checks are there. The question I would have is there a certification that is put? You know, like how you have, if you've paid your local taxes, patent, and then you have a certificate that is out there, or a VAT certificate, and has to be displayed to the public. Do you guys have a certificate of, like a health inspection certificate
that's put on the restaurant?
That's put on the restaurant, and we as a consumer can walk in and see, oh, okay, this place has been checked, and they were checked last week, and everything is okay. They are adhering to standards.
Yeah, you know that our hotels are. They got what we call the star. Our hotels,
The rating,
we have
yes.
the 5 up to the 1 star.
Yeah.
For the restaurants, we are in the process of grading them. Yeah, where if you enter in the restaurant, you will find a certificate showing you that I'm in green. Yeah, when it means when they are in green, it means they are above average between 80 and 90 marks. Yeah, we will use if the grading system. We started the grading system, so we will use different colors: the green one, the blue, the yellow,
So
and
green
the
is
red.
is
Is
the best.
The best one.
Red obviously is
Yes.
the worst.
Yes.
It's temporary closure.
The second will be the blue, between 70 and 80.
And that is once a year?
Sorry.
How long is it valid for?
How
Is it
often
1
will
year,
it be
6
done?
months, 3 months?
We will
The
do it
validity.
on annual basis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that, again, that doesn't help.
Charles,
Yes.
hold your thoughts.
Yes.
We're heading to a break briefly, and we'll be back. Stay tuned. We'll be back after the break.
Many people have been asking what we have been up to. Well, we have told the different stories from decision makers, but this time round it will be different. We will be getting head to head with various influencers and get to the heart of the matter. It is not an easy ride, but we'll endeavor to get you there. It will be insightful, informative, and at times we will agree to disagree, because we are the bridge to your leaders.
La L'aventure continue chaque dimanche 17h et jeudi 18h sur RTV. C'est comme avant, mais avec plus. Plus d'inspiration.
Ne pas reporter à demain ce qu'on doit faire là maintenant.
Plus de motivation.
Garder le cap.
D'accord.
Plus de parcours hors du commun.
44 ans à faire ce que vous aimez.
Plus de souvenirs.
C'est le jour où j'ai retrouvé mon frère, je pensais qu'il était mort.
Plus de fans.
It's just a dance. Ça peut être comme ça.
Plus de secrets.
Non, je suis un horrible cuisse.
Plus de défis.
Ah, vous avez dit oui.
Je l'ai dit.
Plus de divertissement. Plus de découvertes.
Pas seulement être survivant et victime.
Plus de personnalités au parcours inspirant qui se dévoilent. Ne ratez pas le miroir chaque semaine sur Rwanda TV et tous les jours sur les réseaux sociaux.
Many people have been asking what we have been up to. Well, we have told the different stories from decision makers, but this time round it will be different. We will be getting head to head with various influencers and get to the heart of the matter. It is not an easy ride, but we'll endeavor to get you there. It will be insightful, informative, and at times we will agree to disagree because we are the bridge to your leaders.
Welcome back to The Square. We were joined by Alphonsine Mukamunana, who was with us, and right now we'll just go back a bit to the African Union and the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. You had mentioned earlier, Ephraim, and I think you touched on it, Berna. What opportunities should the private sector look into across the continent in different countries to actually leverage on this free trade area?
I think we need to look at what this free trade is doing. First of all, opening opportunities. So before, for instance, we've been looking at the regional level as East African, for instance, the opportunities within East Africa. But now what we have is looking at the whole continent, looking at a much bigger market. So what we expect to see is that the private sector should start actually thinking big. We have to go beyond saying I'm manufacturing for Rwanda or Kenya or Uganda and just start thinking about manufacturing for the whole continent. Because now, with the free trade, you have no excuse. So I think there are huge opportunities there, and perhaps the likes of Ephraim in the business of sugar, I think this is your time.
And just before, Ephraim, you talk, you say something. What I would really like to see is people, especially in the private sector, understanding and adopting a mindset that, you know, looking beyond your local market, we now have to start thinking of a continental market, you know, a regional market, but a continental market. And this is something I'm really hoping, you know, the Made in Rwanda brand, you should start thinking about producing and manufacturing not only in Rwanda, but across the continent.
You know, I'll repeat what I said before. It's not going to be, it's not as straightforward as there's a huge market, you know. Huge markets only benefit companies that have something to export. You know, when you look at the kind of businesses that a lot of our economies are pushing, the lady in the market selling products, the person who has a small gas outlet, to somebody who has a small salon, and that's majority of, and most of them operate in the informal sector. The question is, how do we ensure they're not left behind? Because again, one of the things that free trade areas have the potential to do is they give MNCs, multinational corporations, these large corporations that can do business across regions, across countries. It gives them a great advantage, which, if not handled right, can increase the gap, like I mentioned earlier. But I think, again, one of the statistics that you would see is that one of our largest exports outside of Africa is, I think it's almost 80%, 76% is extractables. These are the minerals, the oil. the gold, in Rwanda it's the 3 T's, the tin, the tungsten, and the tantalum. Now, these constitute 70% of our global exports. Within the continent, we trade with ourselves 40%. Now, the reason why in comparison, in terms of value, there's a huge difference is because the value of extractables is significantly higher. And one of the issues with extractables is also you find that if we had greater production in our local economies that we could trade across, you'd find that would have significantly more value. I'll just give you one simple example. We import about $12 billion of fuel and fuel products.
As a continent?
No, just East Africa.
Just East Africa, the region.
Now, you find such a number. There's probably, like Nigeria, I know they're working on setting up the refinery to become a net exporter of finished petroleum products. You could find that something like a continental free trade area would allow for that. One of the challenges we have is these East African power pools and creating an affordability aspect to buying power across borders, which would help curb some of the energy gaps that we have. But it's also hindered because of inability to find a common trade tariff to enable that to happen. And I think one of the things, when you look at it as a private sector, my biggest challenge is, how can I produce a product that is exportable to the rest of Africa, that is relevant to the remainder of the market, to the rest of the markets? I cannot sit here and think I can compete with a Kenyan entrepreneur, a South African entrepreneur, or a Nigerian entrepreneur doing business the way I've been doing it. I have to, because granted, in Rwanda we talk of being land linked. That now creates a competitive advantage that is unique to our geographical location. Immediately you remove those, and now you open this free trade area, they will be, and one of the challenges is they will be competition. Competition will increase, which is always good for the consumer, but it's never good for the entrepreneur. And this is just economics in general.
I think beyond that, if we look at some of, because I know the private sector is always worried about tariffs, but actually the evidence is such that what actually hinders business, most of it is non-tariff barriers. Yeah. A lot of excessive documentation, a lot of bureaucracy, and this is why when you look at the East African community, for instance, with the recent initiatives around one-stop borders, we are seeing that they are facilitating trade more and they are opening up more opportunities. So imagine if we were to have the issue of, for instance, the initiatives around one-stop borders created across the continent. That would open up opportunities, address issues around excessive documentation, a lot of time wasting that people are currently facing in different parts of the continent. So for me, when I look at the free trade area, I think there is more that can be done even without a lot of money, because it's policy. And when you speak to the private sector, some of the issues they raise is some of them are like policy issues that are not visible. You have barriers that are visible, but policy is not visible. So sometimes you get to a border, for instance, and no one is exactly telling you or what it's not clear what you have to do, who you have to pay. So some of these issues, I think, if the free continental trade can address them, it will help, the private sector to take advantage of the opportunities.
Agreed.
And Ephraim, what you alluded to kind of sounded like sort of protectionist measures.
Now that's what I'm saying.
And as Claire Kamanzi said, I think it was on a show, on Eugene's show on a Sunday, protectionism is actually preservation of inefficiency.
No, but
and
you
this
see,
is something
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm for it.
You're for...
I'm for the continental free trade area.
Yes.
I'm against protectionism.
Of course.
The challenge I'm putting out there, and I'm saying this is a personal one, is that I have to address those inefficiencies. It's the only way my business will survive. And this is a question to Rwandan entrepreneurs, because again, I personally, somebody who deals in the sector on a daily basis, and then I also do business with people from outside the country. We have a long way to go as business people in Rwanda. That we need to do. Again, we can't compete with business as usual, because if I asked you, name one product, maybe there's some technology somewhere, but if I asked you, name one product we can export to the rest of Africa under this continental free trade area, where we are competitive as a player, you would struggle to find something.
I'd like to hear from you, Charles. You've been rather quiet on this issue.
Yeah, because you know, we've been talking about the importance of the private sector in all this, and the private sector has to be prominent and benefit from all this. And I'll take you back a bit to the discussion we're having around mice. And you know, when you have a big meeting like the AU, you would expect that the private sector is going to benefit in different ways. But
it has, to a certain degree.
Yes, it has, to a very large extent, by the way. You know, the hotel industry, or all hotels were fully booked.
High occupancy rates.
Yeah, very high occupancy rate, which is extremely important to sustain these already struggling hotels, with the banks struggling. You know, like, I'm in the real estate business. On our portfolio, we have about 11 hotels that are on the verge of foreclosure. That sort of paints a different image in comparison to promoting mice. So the bigger point I was raising really is if we are going to get the private sector to be able to drive the CFTA, the private sector needs to be supported as much as possible. And I'll be tempted. I know Bernard doesn't want us to have this discussion around the ease of moving during.
That's a discussion for another day.
Yeah. But it comes down to the same point that for the private sector to be able to make money, to be able to move their goods and services from one point to another, I think there's better coordination that needs to be required. That needs to be done. At the level of holding such big events. Please remember that at the end of the day, the sustainability of the CFTA is going to be the success of the private sector, and I think that's extremely important. Yes.
Yeah, and I think beyond that, we need to have more champions that show that some of these things can be done. Rwanda has done that by showing that you can open borders and you're still safe. So we need to see more countries doing that. If it's doing business, we've seen that reducing bureaucracy actually increases your competitiveness. Can we address that? So I think going forward, if we can have more champions, if we can have more countries that can show that this can be done, I think eventually, as a bloc, we'll be more competitive.
I agree. Any closing remarks? We have 2 minutes left.
Closing I would say
remarks on this issue.
I would say. It's because it's also, we don't forget the ratification. You're talking of 44 countries. 44
countries.
Yeah, and then we also have to convince the other 11
remaining
to come on board. But I know the ratification is going to take time. But if the private sector does not take an active role in building capacity, and I think I even talked about this when we talked about the AU reforms. I said we also need to reform our private sectors. Because you see, for example, a multinational, a European-based investor has the capacity to take advantage of this continental free trade area like no man's business. They will maximize, and we've talked of also illicit financial flows on this table. They will repatriate that money and we will not see the economic benefit to it unless the capacity of the private sector is built. Now, we've always had this conversation, and for me, again, sounding like a fanatic, at the expense of sounding like a fanatic, but I genuinely believe deregulation has to happen to create equity in the private sector. And what I mean by that is, if you put stringent measures, you literally are burning the bridge for the informal sector to cross over to the formal. So you find that you have a lot of formal businesses thriving because they're operating, quote unquote, in a conducive environment, and it creates these bubbles of monopolies or these duopolies or oligopolies where you have a bubble and a few players are in it and they are really thriving because it's organized. And the barriers to entry into that bubble are so heavy because you are told you need to comply with 100 things before you get licensed. Which again is understandable. We need to have regulation to ensure that consumers are protected, that business is done in the right manner, that from a tax collection that there's enough funds to run our country. But there has to be that sweet balance. We talked of the banks, and I've heard regulation being talked a lot about financing this free Africa trade, and I said it on our last show, that if we do not address the issue of regulation in our banking sector, we are not actually going to see economic growth. And I'm not saying that we drop regulation because, again, like I said, it's important to have those balancing checks, but we need to get innovative. We can't apply international principles and standards to our economies and we're not willing to take be innovative.
Flexible.
Yeah, because again, we say we need to be innovative to solve our problems, but then the core, or at least the foundation on which we're building, is not willing to move, and it requires that. So for me, I say the private sector is immensely crucial to this.
I think we're all in agreement in that.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit, in terms of heavy regulation, I think it's very right, because what we've seen, for instance, in Kenya with Safaricom has come under a lot of pressure just because it's big in Kenya. And yet we are saying we need to have Safaricom compete at continental level. But Safaricom cannot compete if it's every time regulation is coming and saying, Safaricom, you cannot do this, you cannot do this. Yes, it is big in Kenya, but we need Safaricom to sell the African brand. So I think the issue that you raise in terms of regulation is very important, because quite often you see that you have relatively big companies that are looked at the national level and looked at as big, when in actual sense, when you get that company that they're talking about on a bigger scale, it's actually not as big as you might think, because we are now opening up. The competition is bigger, so we have to look at it in terms of the broader perspective. We are competing at continental level, we are competing with Europe, we are competing with Asia. So can we have African champions that can be able to compete in a global environment?
I like that. Well, it seems we are running out of time. We've come to the end of this show, our first live show. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll be going live every Wednesday at 9 p.m. on Rwanda Television. Please catch repeats at 2:30 p.m. on Thursdays. So there's a repeat of this at 2:30 p.m. on Thursdays. We'll also be uploading this on our YouTube channel immediately after the show. Stay tuned as always. It was a pleasure being here, and I think for our first live session with all the nerves and everything, I think it was a very exciting moment. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned and have a good evening.